Late autumn, 1879. Mesa County, Colorado Territory, a place where the wind does not politely knock before entering your home. It simply arrives, and it arrives with everything the Rocky Mountains have been collecting since October: ice crystals, altitude, and a cold so dry it cracks with before dawn. The valley below the Uncompahgre Plateau was filling up fast. Cattle ranchers, timber workers, and homesteaders were staking claims along the creek beds, where water was close and the ground was flat enough to plow. That was the logic of the frontier. Build near water, build on flat ground, and pray the winter did not kill you before spring. But on a narrow sandstone shelf roughly 200 feet, about 61 meters, above the valley floor, one family was doing something that no one in the region had attempted. Not because it was impossible, but because everyone agreed it was unnecessary, impractical, and more than a little strange. The most respected builder in the county looked up at that shelf in September of 1879 and said, plainly and publicly, that what was being constructed up there was dangerous, wasteful, and would not survive the first hard freeze. He was not a small man, in reputation or in frame. His word carried weight in that valley the way sandstone carries heat, slowly absorbed, long retained. He was wrong about all of it. Today, you're going to understand exactly why the worst idea on the plateau became the most copied building strategy within 30 miles, and why the valley that laughed at that shelf no longer exists. If you've ever wondered what the old-timers understood about cold, rock, and shelter that modern construction seems to have forgotten, hit subscribe right now. Every week, we go back into the frontier record to pull out the techniques that worked when working meant surviving. Don't miss a single one. His name was Thomas Cord. He had come west from Ohio in 1876 with his wife, Margaret, and their 3 children, following the same worn promise that pulled thousands of families across the Missouri. Cheap land, open sky, a fresh start, 4-2 winners. Cord had built and lived exactly the way everyone else did in that part of Colorado Territory. He chose a creekside plot, erected a timber frame cabin with a standard central hearth, and stacked firewood against the north wall. The first winter was difficult. The second came close to catastrophic. The problem, Cord later told a neighbor, was not the cold itself. It was where the cold came from. The valley funneled wind. The creek drew moisture. And the moisture did something to his firewood that no one warned him about. It rotted the outer layer of every cord he stacked against the ground, turning what should have been 6 weeks of fuel into 3. By February of 1878, he was burning fence posts. He also noticed something that winter that most of his neighbors overlooked because they were too busy managing their own misery. On certain nights, when the temperature in the valley dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, around minus 18 degrees Celsius, the sandstone outcroppings on the cliff face above them held warmth until well past midnight. He could see it, not with a thermometer, but with his eyes. Snow that landed on the exposed rock faces did not accumulate the way it did on the valley floor. It slid, or it melted in thin patches, hours after the air temperature had plunged. Thomas Cord was not an engineer. He was a man who had run out of fence posts and was paying very close attention to rocks. In the spring of 1879, he filed a claim on a sandstone shelf 200 feet above the valley. His wife, by most accounts, did not think it was a good idea. His neighbors were more direct about it. But Cord had made up his mind, and he had, for the first time in 3 years, a specific plan. What Thomas Cord proposed to build was not a house perched on a cliff. It was a house built into a cliff. And the distinction matters enormously. His plan was to use the existing sandstone overhang as a rear wall and partial roof, excavating a shallow alcove of roughly 8 feet, about 2.4 meters, into the rock face to serve as the back third of the structure. The front 2/3 would be conventional timber framing, sealed with mud mortar and animal hair, the standard chinking of the frontier. But the rear wall would be living stone, 6 to 8 feet of solid sandstone that had spent every summer absorbing heat and every winter releasing it slowly, like a furnace that never fully went out. This concept has a name that Cord almost certainly did not know: thermal mass. Dense, heavy materials, stone, brick, adobe, rammed earth, absorb heat slowly and release it even more slowly. A sandstone wall of sufficient thickness can absorb a full day of sun and radiate that warmth back into a space for 6 to 10 hours after the fire dies. Cord had not read about this in any journal. He had watched it happen on the rock face above him for 2 winters in a row. The floor of his alcove structure was also critical. He built it elevated, 18 inches, about 45 centimeters, off the ground, on a frame of peeled logs sealed with clay, creating a dead air space beneath the living quarters. Dead air is one of the most effective insulating materials available to a 19th century builder. It does not conduct heat the way solid material does. It simply sits, trapping warmth above it and blocking cold below. His firebox, a small corner hearth rather than a large central one, was positioned in the front left corner of the structure, angled to direct radiant heat toward the stone rear wall rather than out through the door. The stone would absorb that heat, store it, and give it back through the night. The total floor space of the finished structure was approximately 280 square feet, about 26 square meters. By the standard of the valley below, it looked absurdly small. By the physics of thermal mass and draft geometry, it was almost exactly right. His name appears in county records as R.V. Altman, and in the autumn of 1879, he was the most experienced timber frame builder in that part of Mesa County. He had constructed 7 cabins in the valley over the previous 4 years, and by local accounts, every one of them was still standing. His opinion was not idle gossip. It was a frontier equivalent of a building inspector's report. Altman visited the shelf in late September, while Cord was still laying the foundation logs. He stood at the edge of the construction, studied the alcove excavation, looked at the elevated floor frame, and said, in front of at least 4 other men, that the whole structure would fill with smoke, that the rear wall would weep moisture in spring thaw, that the elevated floor would rot from underneath within 3 winters, and that if the family was lucky, they would freeze. If they were unlucky, the overhang would shift. That is not a home, he reportedly said. That is a coffin with a view. The phrase traveled. By October, it had reached a trading post 6 miles south, where someone had improved it slightly. A coffin with a very good view. Men laughed. Women expressed concern. The general consensus along the creek was that Thomas Cord had worked himself into a strange state of mind, and that Margaret deserved better than to spend a Colorado winter inside a rock. A local timber supplier refused to extend Cord credit on materials, not as an act of malice, but because, as he told a neighbor, he did not want to profit from something he expected to fail before Christmas. Even among the few who said nothing openly, the silence carried the same message. This will not work, and we are waiting politely to be proven right. The shelf looked, from the valley, like a muddy scrape in the stone. Small, odd, impractical. Not what a man builds when he intends to live. Thomas Cord kept building. December of 1879 arrived without apology. The first storm hit the Uncompahgre Plateau on December 11th and did not finish what it started until December 16th. 5 days of snowfall. The valley floor received an estimated 38 inches, about 97 centimeters, before it stopped. Temperatures fell to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius on the morning of December 14th, according to a weather log kept by a schoolteacher in the nearest settlement. She noted that the ink in her pen froze before she finished writing the entry. It was not the worst single storm the region had seen, but it arrived on top of ground that was already saturated from a wet November. The creek beds, which every sensible homesteader had built beside, became something else in those 5 days. Ice dams formed upstream. Water backed up and then found new paths across the flat bottomland where the cabin sat, under door frames, through the gaps in floor-level chinking, into root cellars. 3 families on the valley floor lost their primary firewood supply in the first 48 hours. The wood had been stacked ground level, and the water table rose fast enough to soak the bottom 2/3 of every cord before anyone fully understood what was happening. Wetwood does not burn with enough heat to matter. It smolders, produces smoke, and provides a slow and demoralizing lesson in the difference between dry fuel and wet fuel. R.V. Altman's own cabin, one of the best-built structures in the valley by any honest measure, held up structurally, but his firewood situation was no better than his neighbors. He burned furniture on December 15th. 200 feet above all of this, Thomas Cord's small stone-backed cabin sat dry. His firewood was stored under a covered ledge in the alcove itself, not on the valley floor, not exposed to groundwater, not buried under 38 inches of wet snow. It had been drying since September, in a space where the rock face itself acted as a windbreak. When December 14th brought its worst hour, Cordeswood was as dry as the day he split it. Stay with me through the next section, because the numbers that came out of that winter are the reason the valley never looked at that shelf the same way again. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We cover a different frontier technique every week. Things that work when life depended on getting it right. The comparison that emerged from the winter of 1879 to 1880 was not gathered by a scientist or recorded in any official report. It was assembled piece by piece through the frank conversations that frontier communities have after crisis, when people stop being proud and start being honest. Thomas Cord burned approximately 1.8 cords of wood between December 1st and March 1st. His neighbors on the valley floor, in cabins of comparable or larger size, averaged between 3.5 and 4.2 cords for the same period. That is a consumption gap of roughly 50 to 55%. The explanation is not mysterious. The sandstone rear wall of Cord's alcove structure, approximately 6 feet thick at its deepest point, functioned as a passive heat reservoir. Every fire Cord lit warmed not just the air in a room, but also the stone behind it. That stone, once warmed, continued radiating heat back into the space for between 6 and 9 hours after the fire was reduced to coals. On the nights when temperatures outside dropped below minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 23 degrees Celsius, the interior of Cord's cabin reportedly held above 48 degrees Fahrenheit, about 9 degrees Celsius, at floor level, measured by the simple frontier test of weather water in a clay pot near the ground froze overnight. It did not. In at least 2 valley cabins that week, it did. The elevated floor also performed exactly as Cord had calculated. Cold air, being denser than warm air, settled beneath the floor frame rather than entering through it. The dead air space created an insulating buffer that kept the living surface roughly 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 to 7 degrees Celsius, warmer than a ground-level floor would have been in the same conditions. The overhang, the feature Altman had called structural risk, served an additional function no one had credited. It blocked the prevailing northwest wind from hitting the front wall of the cabin directly, reducing convective heat loss through the timber framing by an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 compared to an exposed valley structure. The smoke problem Altman predicted never materialized. The corner hard geometry, combined with a natural updraft created by warm stone and a well-placed flue, produced a draw strong enough that Cord reported almost no backdraft through the entire winter. The structure stayed livable when others scrambled. It used half the wood. It kept its floor above freezing on the coldest nights. And the rock that everyone said would weep moisture showed no signs of seepage, because the overhang above shed water away from the face year-round. Not a single one of Altman's predictions had come true. Spring came, and the valley took stock. The creek beds that had seemed like such obvious locations for settlement in 1876 and 1877 looked different in March of 1880. The ground was still waterlogged in places. Several families had spent portions of December and January in neighbors' homes. One family had relocated entirely, loading what they could carry and abandoning a structure they had spent 2 summers building. Thomas Cord came down from the shelf in February to help dig out a family half a mile south. He arrived in better condition than most of his neighbors, rested, fed, and by all accounts, quiet about it. He did not say anything pointed. He did not remind anyone of what had been said about coffins with views. He helped dig, shared coffee, and went back up the cliff. The question started in April, when the ground dried enough for people to think clearly again. A neighbor named Carl was the first to climb up to the shelf and ask Cord directly how the rear wall construction worked. Cord showed him. Another man came in May, a homesteader from the southern end of the valley who had spent most of December burning greenwood and coughing from the smoke. By June, Cord had explained the alcove technique and the floor construction to 7 different men. R.V. Altman did not visit that spring, but by late summer of 1880, his framing crew was incorporating elevated floor construction, 14 to 16 inches off ground, into 2 new cabins along the creek. He did not reference Cord by name in any record. He did not need to. By the winter of 1882, local accounts suggest that at least 11 structures within a 40-mile 64-kilometer radius had incorporated some version of the alcove principle or the elevated insulating floor, or both. The techniques traveled through observation and conversation, the way frontier knowledge always moved, not through books or blueprints, but through the quiet authority of a cold winter survived without burning furniture. No one called it Cord's method. No one called it anything. It was simply what people in that part of the plateau began to do, because it worked, and because the winter of 1879 had demonstrated, without ambiguity, what not working looked like. Thomas Cord was not an innovator in the way that word is usually meant. He did not invent thermal mass. He did not discover the physics of dead air insulation or corner draft geometry. The ancestral Puebloans had built into the sandstone alcoves of the Colorado Plateau for centuries before European settlement, using the same rock faces, the same overhangs, and the same basic principle. Stone remembers heat. The land already knew this. Cord was paying attention. What makes a story worth telling and worth remembering is not the originality of the idea, but the precision of the observation. He watched rock faces in winter. He noticed where snow melted and where it did not. He tracked where cold air pooled and where it did not reach. And then he built a home that matched what he'd seen, even when every respected voice in the valley told him he was wrong. This is the thing about traditional building knowledge that gets lost when we talk about it only in terms of nostalgia or folklore. It is not soft knowledge. It is not guesswork dressed up in old photographs. It is applied physics, developed through observation and failure and long, cold nights of recalculation, passed down not because people thought it was charming, but because it worked. The valley that laughed at Thomas Cord's shelf does not look the same today as it did in 1879. The creek floods, the bottomland shifts, the flat ground that seems so obvious, so practical, so sensible, is also the ground that fills with water when a mountain decides it has somewhere else to be. The rock is still there. Stone remembers. The people who learned to read it survived. What part of this design would you actually use in a build today? Drop it in the comments. The elevated floor, the stone rear wall, the corner hearth, or the covered firewood alcove. And tell us, where are you watching from and what's the coldest winter you've personally dealt with? If this is the kind of history that matters to you, real techniques, real conditions, real consequences, subscribe now. We pull a new story from a frontier record every single week. You don't want to miss what's coming next.